Outfield is so great that we need 2 episodes to cover the position. Welcome to Fantasy Baseball today. Frank Stanfield here with Scott White and Chris Towers. It is July 6th. We are 17 days away from opening day. Hopefully, the Nationals versus the Yankees. Garrett Cole versus Max Scherzer. Scott, what's going on, man? How was your July 4th weekend?
It was great. Yeah. Got a little sun. It looks like you did too, Frank.
Oh, gosh. Way too much sun.
One of the benefits of being on YouTube. Everybody gets to see your lobsterish appearance.
Oh, my God. You don't want to see anything like under this shirt right now. I'm just going to, you can kind of see my neck here. This is why you need to watch on our Fantasy Baseball Today YouTube channel. But I did go to the beach yesterday, social distance, had the mask, everything. And it was like 95 degrees yesterday in New York. So I applied sunscreen twice. I still turned out looking like this. I don't feel great. My shoulders are crispy bacon right now. Chris Towers, you are here as well. It wasn't just July 4th this weekend. No. It was Chris's birthday. Happy birthday to you. There you go, Chris.
We just only played a little bit of it. Yes, it was my birthday.
Happy birthday, buddy.
And, I definitely love celebrating my birthday. It's not a thing that causes me a lot of stress when everybody's like, oh, what do you want? What do you want to do? What do you want to do? It's just like, just please leave me alone. Somebody decide for me. I don't want to. But I did get a new guitar. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see half of it here. It's very pretty. And that's it. That's absolutely it. I did not go to the beach. I barely went outside.
Don't do it. Don't go outside. Don't go to the beach.
I hate the beach. Extremely Anakin Skywalker voice. I hate sand. It's rough and coarse. I completely co-sign Anakin Skywalker's feelings about the relative merits of sand.
I mentioned we're obviously going to do our Outfield Preview 2.0 Part 1 today. That's a mouthful and interesting to say. But before we do that, there was a lot of news and notes from over the weekend. Typically, we don't want to do this on our position preview, but there's a lot to get to, so we are going to talk about that first and foremost. And we're getting a lot of COVID positive test results back. We are getting players opting out as well. We spoke about a few of those players last week, Scott, but perhaps none of them had the same clout, the same status as David Price, who did opt out of the 2020 season this past weekend. Scott, how does that affect things in the Dodgers rotation? Who do you think can jump in? As of now, Roster Resource has Ross Stripling stepping in as the 5th starter for the Dodgers.
Yeah, friend of the show, Ross Stripling, right? We had a good conversation with him during the shutdown. And the way he puts it, he was told he was disappointed when the rotation was filled out so early in spring training. They announced Julio Urias in the 4th spot, Alex Wood in the 5th spot. He had a conversation with his manager and GM, and they basically told him he'd be the next one up. So, they're not committing to him yet. So that's, there seems to be a little bit of a disagreement there. And I don't know, maybe Ross Stripling has the leg up. He was an all-star as a starter in 2018. His numbers the last 2 years are really good. 3.22 ERA, 1.17 whip, 9.7 K per 9. He says he'd be ready to throw 6 innings from day one, which a lot of pitchers are saying. Honestly, that's another interesting sidebar, some of the news this weekend. But of course, they have Dustin May there, who is a top prospect who pitched very well down the stretch. And usually prospects of his stature who make that kind of first impression, they're shoo-ins for a rotation spot. It's kind of surprising he doesn't have one already. Tony Gonsolin, another exciting rookie there. I'm less. I think it'll be one of Stripling and May. I'm moving them both up to some degree, but this also kind of bolsters my my enthusiasm for Alex Wood and Julio Urias now, because with less rotation surplus, there's less chance they're going to fall into that piggyback scenario where they're only going 4 or 5 innings every time. The Dodgers need them for more length now without David Price being there.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. It wouldn't surprise me if we see Stripling and Dustin May in that piggyback role now, where one of those guys goes 3 innings, the other one follows another 3 innings. Maybe they do get Tony Gonsolin in that mix. Jimmy Nelson still on this team. Remains to be seen, how they're going to use him yet. But yeah, I think that was very well said. I think you should be boosting guys like Urias and Alex Wood up your draft board as well. the latest news that we have, literally just before we started recording again, Monday, July 6th, was that Joey Gallo just tested positive for COVID of the Texas Rangers, and he is asymptomatic as of now, and he will be quarantined. But we also got some other positive tests in the first round of testing over the weekend. 38 positive COVID tests. It was a 1.2% positive rate where, look, ideally in a perfect world, we would have 0 positive results. But 1.2%, that's about as good as it can get. So,
and that 38 includes staff and coaches,
yes,
right?
I believe it was 31 players and 7 staff members.
Yeah, they tested like 3,100 people total.
Yeah, and that included Freddie Freeman, who tested positive, Gallo, as I mentioned, DJ LeMahieu. Aaron Nola is an interesting one because I saw earlier today that he's actually at Phillies camp. So did he test positive? Did he not test positive?
Well, he was put on the Phillies had a few players who were put on the COVID-19 IL, which doesn't necessarily mean they tested positive themselves.
Okay, so
he might have had
some.
Neris has showed up at camp since then. He was one we talked about Friday, and Aaron Nola was actually throwing today. So it sounds like he's in the clear for that, which is of course good news for him and his value. And yeah, it sounds like Aaron Nola's back.
A few other names worth mentioning: Tommy Pham, Salvador Perez, and Miguel Sano also tested positive this weekend. Masahiro Tanaka has a mild concussion. Chris, we are going to talk about Giancarlo Stanton today, your favorite player, but he continues to do nothing right. He hit a line drive right off of Tanaka's head, and it was actually a pretty scary moment. I would say the fact that Tanaka just walked away with a mild concussion here, I think he should consider himself pretty lucky.
Yeah, and it was, it was a scary moment. James Paxton actually pitched next in that simulated game and pitched behind an L net, whatever it's called. So, that's definitely something that you don't, you never want to see. It sounds like, Tanaka does have a mild concussion. Sounds like the effects of that are pretty limited right now, but I did see one Yankees beat writer report or note that, Clint Frazier had a mild concussion in spring training of 2018, and he missed like 2 months. And so this is the thing with concussions is we never know exactly how the recovery process is going to be. He could be back in 7 days, or he could be, out for a long time. It's just kind of until we get further along in the process, we don't really know, but we will get updates on it. MLB does have a specific concussion protocol. So we should know something in the next, week or so.
Should we talk about Freddie Freeman a little more?
So apparently Freddie Freeman's positive test apparently was part of why Nick Markakis decided to opt out, which was announced today on Monday. He said in talking to Freddie Freeman, it made him realize how serious this is. And it does, it does sound like Freddie Freeman is having, perhaps more severe symptoms than your typical player in his situation.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know for sure who is, it's not always revealed with these positive tests if the player's symptomatic or not, but Freeman, first of all, he's the highest profile player to have a positive test, and it happens to be symptomatic. So, and he was, there were reports that he was feeling, a little better Sunday. So hopefully he'll come out of it pretty quickly. But like that combination of being symptomatic, of being the most high end player to get it, like this is a guy people are drafting in round 2. And should they, based on what we know right now? I think that seems like a big risk.
I mean, I think ultimately the way you have to balance this is if you're drafting now July 6th or July 7th or July 8th, early on, I think you are maybe a little more wary of these guys. But as we get closer to the season, we should get more updates. We should get more, clarity on who will be available to start the season. But this is just, it's a huge unknown variable that we're dealing with. And it's really hard to say, exactly how to approach it.
Yeah, and it's a scary topic, and we've talked about this. Adam talked about this on the show, and he struggles with it on the football podcast as well because, look, we're talking about a fantasy game when there's much more at stake here than just fantasy baseball, right? It's, hopefully Freddie Freeman is healthy and comes out of this okay, and so it's kind of weird, and we are acknowledging that to be talking about, players for fantasy and where they should be drafting amidst a pandemic and while players are testing positive for COVID, but it is something that we do need to address. And look, I would say push your drafts back as close to the start of the season, July 23rd, as you possibly can. But if you're drafting now, I think that you probably do have to have some concern over drafting Freddie Freeman. And I think with that, it's a good way to kind of transition into outfield because we continue to get questions regarding Mike Trout and the top 5 picks in fantasy baseball leagues, pretty much across the board, at least by ADP, are all outfielders. Mike Trout, 1.6. Ronald Acuna, 1.6. Christian Yelich, 3.0. Cody Bellinger, 4.0. Mookie Betts, 5.6. Those are your top 5 picks in ADP. And Scott, the latest report involving Mike Trout says that he is on the fence in terms of playing this season and will, quote, play it by ear. We know that he has a wife that is due in August. She's currently pregnant. And, is he going to be able to just go on a normal paternity leave and come back and everything will be okay? Or will he need to quarantine? So we have all these questions, and because of that, it seems like Mike Trout's status is up in the air. So we're talking about Freddie Freeman. I think we have to have Trout in this discussion. Do we start to move him down? I know I asked you guys last week and maybe even 2 weeks ago, but I think it's a little bit more serious now, Scott.
Yeah, I actually don't read as much into his comments as it seems like a lot of people are. I mean, he says if there's an outbreak, you definitely have to reconsider. I mean, he says the sorts of things where if you pressed any player, they would probably say the same thing. He's the level of concern he expresses doesn't rise to the level of like a Sean Doolittle for me. But, one thing that I have thought about with Trout is, he's obviously going to leave for the birth of his child whenever that happens. And he'll have to go. Actually, Zach Wheeler brought this up because his wife is due basically around the start of the season. And he thought he'd miss at least 2 starts because you have to factor in not just the time away, but the intake process. Now, the intake process, obviously there was, it went very slowly for some teams this weekend. Like some teams still aren't able to work out yet because they don't have all the test results back. But for the teams that it did work out well for, you're still talking about 2 or 3 days usually. So that's how much, like half a week almost of going through intake again and being cleared to play again. So if, I'm assuming when Zach Wheeler brought it up, he was talking about 3 days for paternity leave, 7 days for family medical leave, and then intake. And that's how you arrive at least 2 starts. You're talking about at least 2 weeks at that point. I don't know if Trout's thinking the same way in terms of missing 10 days or in terms of missing 3 for just the standard parental leave. I don't know. I don't think he'd reveal that, but if you're talking about missing a week or more from a 9.5 week season, like that, regardless of opting out, that's reason I think to at least consider dropping him to the bottom of that top 5, or at least behind like Christian Yelich.
Yeah, and that's something that I would do, especially in a roto league, Scott. I mean, we both have Acuna, Trout, and Yelich for the same auction price, $42. If they're going for the same price and you don't have the same level of concern or any level of doubt whatsoever over Acuna and Yelich, I think you have to at least drop Trout behind those other 2. And I think you can argue that you should drop him behind Mookie Betts and Cody Bellinger. So, Chris, what do you think? Where would you draft Mike Trout right now?
I would have a hard time if I picked 5th and he was there to not take him.
Yeah,
I definitely understand.
But would you take the other 4 ahead of him?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably the safer way to go, I guess, if you have to look at it that way.
Scott, so if you are choosing between Acuna and Yelich in Roto, who are you going with?
Acuna, yeah. I came to this determination months ago after initially being someone who insisted Trout had to go first overall. Obviously, this was pre-pandemic world where we were talking about that. But Acuna, just because Like all 5 of those guys will help some in steals, but Acuna will help the most, and he will help, I think, the most assuredly too. Like he'll give the most, and you can be most confident he'll be an asset in that stolen base category, which is something that you pretty much have to fill in the early rounds without taking a real hit in some other area. So just to have that taken care of, from your very first pick, a guy is going to give you a ton of power numbers too. In a traditional 5x5 league, I think I've came around to the idea that that's the way you have to go. Obviously, it changes in a points league. Acuna isn't even in my top 5 in a points league because of plate discipline issues. But for the steals, yeah, I'll take him first overall in Roto.
So does that make Yelich the number 1 player in a head-to-head points league, Scott?
I guess so. I mean, this is the first time I'm really talking about moving Trout down. But yeah, I guess that's where I am with that.
So I do want to point out, in Roto scoring last year, Ronald Acuna was the number 1 player. Christian Yelich was number 2, even though he only played 131 games. Basically missed a fifth of the season. And it was really close by my measure. I have basically the score for Acuna is 19.98. The score for Christian Yelich is 19.65. Number 3 was Cody Bellinger. He was further away from Christian Yelich than Christian Yelich was from Acuna. And again, that was with him missing, playing 25 fewer games. If you put everyone on the same scale, Christian Yelich was the best player in fantasy last year by a substantial margin. Like the gap between him and number 2 on a per game basis, which was Fernando Tatis, is the same as the gap between Fernando Tatis and looks like that would be Rafael Devers at number 15. That's on a per game basis.
Wow.
And so obviously that doesn't mean Christian Yelich is going to do it again, but I think the question comes down to whether Christian Yelich is going to steal.
Yep.
If he were, he was leading the NL in home runs and stolen bases when he got hurt.
He went 30 of 32 on the base paths in terms of steals.
You can't expect that kind of efficiency ever again. Like that's outrageously efficient. But if he's still going to run at a high pace, he's probably the number 1 player. I have more confidence that Ronald Acuna is going to run at that level than I do Christian Yelich.
Yeah, that was the assuredly point. I brought up most assuredly a base stealer because it was a career high for Yelich, and he's coming back from a fractured kneecap. I don't know what impact that's really going to have, but it's worth pointing out it was the same injury that Jose Altuve had. And, once he came back from it, he basically stopped running. Could have just been a coincidence, but could have been a decision. Like, I don't want to risk my knees anymore if I don't have to, but, Yelich could make that same decision. Like Acuna batting leadoff, stealing bases is just one of the many things he does. And you don't have to have any concerns about that with him.
Acuna, 41 home runs and 37 steals in his age 21 season last year. He was 3rd in baseball with 127 runs scored. Yelich, I don't think we have any doubts over, he's done it 2 years in a row now. So I think we pretty much trust, yes, while he has an incredibly high home run to fly ball ratio, he's done it 2 years in a row. So
he's always had an incredibly high home run to fly ball ratio. Even back when he wasn't hitting a lot of home runs, he was always in a 20% kind of range for home run to fly ball ratio. I actually think he might be a little safer as a power hitter than Ronald Acuna. You look at what they did last season, Ronald Acuna, as a rookie, Ronald Acuna had the same number of home runs as doubles, 26 each. Last season, he had 22 doubles, 41 home runs. When you look at Ronald Acuna, overall, he was actually a slightly worse hitter than his rookie season. He only had an 883 OPS last year, and that's because the total number of extra base hits wasn't exactly all that high. If some of those home runs turn into doubles, which I think is more likely than not, he might be more of like a 35 homer pace guy, whereas Christian Yelich, he hit 44 in 131 games last season.
Scott, in 30 seconds or left, you're on the board at pick, let's say 3 now, because we're moving Trout down. You're taking Mookie Betts or Cody Bellinger. Give it to me in both formats.
It's Bellinger in both formats. I I just think I think the upside he showed last year was a little more convincing than the upside Betts showed in a couple of his best years. And Betts isn't coming off his best season. He had kind of a down season. Certainly more power is there for Bellinger. And with Betts kind of dropping off as a steal source and now going to a team that isn't big on stolen bases in the Dodgers, I'm not sure how big the steals advantage Betts will have is. And I think in terms of batting average, it's basically a wash. I could see maybe taking Betts ahead of Bellinger in a points league because Betts Betts doesn't strike out much, but then again, Bellinger, I guess, stopped striking out so much too last year. So yeah, I'll definitely go Bellinger over Betts. I think that was longer than 30 seconds. Sorry. Chris,
you are team Bellinger over Betts too, right?
Yeah, but I think ultimately it's like a slightly weighted coin flip, like 55-45 or something like that. If you end up with Betts, you should still feel really, really good about your team.
Can't disagree with that. The late first round of ADP is basically Juan Soto Island. He's the only outfielder that's going in this range. His ADP is 11.2. Last year, he was the sixth best outfielder in both head-to-head points and in Roto. He was a top 16 player in both formats overall. He has a 937 OPS over his first 1,153 plate appearances. He can hit both righties and lefties. He's really the total package. Scott, I've got to ask, when it comes to Soto, where do you kind of lump him in with the other hitters that are going around that range? Guys like Alex Bregman, Nolan Arenado, and let's even throw Jose Ramirez in that mix. If you had to insert Juan Soto somewhere among those players, where would he rank?
I have him 15th overall in Roto, which would be right ahead of Jose Ramirez. But well behind like Bregman and Lindor, who I have going in the middle of round one. I'm kind of on the lower side for Juan Soto, I think, relative to the industry as a whole, because it's kind of, for him to justify where he's going on average, he has to improve yet again. The numbers aren't quite there supporting his ADP. And I think it was 12 for 12 in steals last year. So I'm still not sure how much of a contributor he's really going to be for that. Obviously, what he's done at this stage of his career is very impressive, and downside wise, I don't see much downside there at all. It's a very different situation from like Fernando Tatis, who's also unproven. But, in terms of batting average, home run expectations, I'm not sure Juan Soto really even deserves to be ahead of like JD Davis as far as that goes. But, I rank him ahead of JD Martinez.
I was about to say, JD Davis is going like 15 rounds later.
But I rank him ahead of Martinez, too.
Ultimately, I think part of the inflation there is, one, he's 21 years old. He couldn't drink alcohol until, I think, the World Series last year. He couldn't participate in the champagne celebrations. I think partially it's that, and then partially he went 12 for 13 in stolen bases last season. I think people look at him and say, well, he'll give you something in stolen bases. I'm not so sure. Obviously, 12 for 13 is a really, really difficult number to sustain. He wasn't nearly that efficient as a base stealer in the minors. He's not exactly a speedster. And so, once you start looking at it that way, maybe 8 stolen bases was probably, 8 to 9 stolen bases was probably a more realistic outcome. And then, add in that it's a shortened season. So those are going to be kind of, those could be bunchy, and there could be a stretch where he just doesn't steal any bases.
What do you have him for, Chris? 3 or 4 steals?
I mean, that makes a big difference. I just, you do look at his monthly log, and it's 3-0-2-3-4-0. So if you get that May to June run where he had 0 and 2, all of a sudden he really is, legitimately a nothing in that category in a way that makes it pretty hard to get excited about him when it comes to stolen bases. And, on a per game basis last year in Roto, he was actually the number 27 hitter. He was number 15 overall, 27 on per game basis. And so, like Scott said, he is being drafted to take another step forward, and he absolutely could be. He's young enough, and Frank and I have him in the Hall of Fame already.
That's right.
But yeah, I have a harder time. I don't think I've drafted him at all this season, actually.
I don't think I have either.
Probably more bullish on him in a points league. I mean, his walk rate is just so ridiculous. Again, he wasn't even 21, a 16% walk rate or better each of his first 2 seasons. So 3.9 fantasy points per game last year.
It's in terms of outfielders points per game last year, it goes Yelich, Trout, Bellinger, then George Springer actually bats. So you got the top 4 there, leaving Acuna out, and then Soto. Soto's actually ahead of Acuna in points per game last year.
Yeah, and actually, like, I want to say, like, if it sounds like we're down on Juan Soto,
I'm not. You guys might be a little bit more, down on him than I am.
I'm definitely not down on Juan Soto. Like, I want to say, like, Juan Soto is the kind of player who should not exist. Like, a young left-handed hitter who is this good, who has this good of plate discipline, who hits lefties this well as a 19 and 20-year-old, like, that is basically unprecedented. He is one of arguably the best young hitter in Major League Baseball history.
But you have to pay the price to get him.
For fantasy, I think it's probably a little early to have him ranked as high as he is.
Rounds 2 and 3 in ADP. JD Martinez going off the board at pick 22. Bryce Harper 1 pick later at 23. Starling Marte 28.8. So an early to mid third round pick. And then Charlie Blackmon at 35.6. He is a late third round pick. Scott, between JD Martinez and Bryce Harper, who do you prefer in both formats? Something I noticed over JD Martinez. Let me know if this matters at all to you, Scott. Last year, a 1381 OPS versus lefties, 793 versus right-handed pitching. That was his lowest since 2013, back when he was on the Astros. Before he was the JD Martinez we would come to know and love for fantasy. Do these splits matter at all for you when it comes to JD Martinez?
I sometimes see splits, like when a player starts to struggle against the same-handed pitcher. You sometimes associate that with age, and Martinez is 32 now. I have to admit I hadn't noticed it, so this is the first I'm considering it for him. But the thing for me with Martinez is, like, his expected stats last year were very similar across the board. Like, he got off to a slow start, and it kind of kept his season-long numbers down from the first round range that we had gotten used to seeing him the previous couple years. But I mean, it like, he's still profiled very similar to 2018, 2017, when he performed more like a first round pick. It's all very hard. It makes all the kind of contact you want to see from an elite hitter. And so that's still how I'm regarding him. Yes, the 32, it's getting into a range with the age where it's starting to get a little worrisome, but I don't see, like, that split there on its own, especially with the batted ball profile still looking so strong. That's not enough to really raise an alarm for me for Martinez. And I think he's actually maybe being a little undervalued. I don't draft him as much as I'd like because I'm looking at starting pitcher in this range so often, but I like the value for Martinez this year.
Chris, I haven't heard your thoughts. I'm not sure at all, really, throughout the past couple of months on Bryce Harper, who got off to a really slow start his first season with the Phillies. The first 2 months, he hit 248 with a 30% strikeout rate. From June 1st on, he hit 267 with a 23.6% strikeout rate. So lowered those strikeouts and had 25 home runs with a 903 OPS from June 1st on. To put that in perspective, Cody Bellinger in that same time frame hit 262 with a 933 OPS, 27 home runs. So the same time period, Bryce Harper just hit 2 less home runs, actually had a better batting average. His OPS was 30 points lower. How do you feel about Bryce Harper, Scott? Chris, rather.
He's excellent. Like, there's not really, like, he's another guy who I haven't necessarily drafted a ton of, but it's not because I'm avoiding him. It's just usually, when I get to that point in the draft, I'm usually looking to take a starting pitcher, usually Patrick Corbin in that range. And so, he hasn't been someone that I've ended up with too many times, but there's really nothing wrong with his profile. Like, if the Phillies are going to let him steal, 15 to 20 bases a year, like they did, last year he had 18 attempts, 15 of them steals. I think he's probably better than 260 batting average. I think, there is positive regression coming from him, and
his expected batting average was 279 last year. So
right, and I think, there have been weird things going on with Bryce Harper the last couple of years where, like, he's been especially susceptible to the shift. He's Seen that strikeout rate really fluctuate and really go up over the last couple of seasons before, last year starting to trend down. If he can sustain that improvement in strikeout rate from the second half of last year, yeah, you're looking at a potential first rounder. And I think he's a fine value where he's going.
Scott, did you answer, would you rather have Martinez or Harper in both formats?
It's Martinez in both formats. Like I said, I think he's still capable of first-round production. I mean, he hit 304 with 36 homers, 105 RBI, 98 runs last year, and we're talking about it like it's a down season.
For Martinez, it was basically he didn't hit for much power in the first half, but there was no explanation for it. It wasn't like the exit velocity was down. He just had a weird couple of months to start the season, and then he was immediately that guy we've come to know and love.
And Harper, I mean, he was looking like a modest base stealer again, so he has that advantage, at least in Roto League. But I think we've seen enough now to know he's going to fall more in that 260, 270 range with batting average than, put up MVP caliber numbers like he has in the past.
Starling Marte, I mentioned, is going just slightly after these guys and is someone who can actually help you out in the scarce category, specifically in Roto. He gives you batting average. He will give you steals. And he actually was pretty good in points leagues last year for the first time ever. I mean, he just improved as a hitter across the board in his age 30 season, no less. 3.7 fantasy points per game. That was tied for 10th with JD Martinez. So I've got to ask, Scott, why doesn't Starling Marte get more love? He averaged the same fantasy points per game as JD Martinez. I think you could actually argue he's a better Roto player than JD Martinez.
I mean, certainly we talk a lot about how Carlos Santana is kind of like the face of points leagues, like the player who most clearly distinguishes himself in that format. And that's what Starling Marte always was to me in Roto leagues prior to last year when he achieved new heights as a power hitter. But he didn't run like we're used to seeing last year. I mean, he's getting to an age where, you wonder how long that's going to be, how much of that profile, how much of his profile that base stealing is still going to be. A guy on a 25 kind of pace with a good batting average is an asset for sure in Roto leagues, but it's not somebody who's going to rise to the level of like a first round pick, like JD Martinez is capable of doing. To me, it puts Starling Marte, somewhere in between JD Martinez and like Tommy Pham, who of course goes several rounds later. I don't see him as a top flight outfielder. I don't think he has that kind of upside, but certainly if you're looking to take care of two scarce categories early, Starling Marte is a player who's going to help you with that.
Chris, Charlie Blackmon was a top 12 outfielder in both formats still last year in both Roto and head-to-head points leagues. He actually averaged 3.8 fantasy points per game, so he was slightly better than both Starling Marte and JD Martinez, who we just talked about. The steals are trending down. We know that 17,
they're
14, 12, and then last year it was just 2, but still scores a lot of runs, still hits for a very high batting average. We know the splits. Like, he hits much better at home in Coors Field. And then on top of that, he did test positive for COVID back on June 23rd when it was reported. So are you still comfortable taking him in this third round range? Should you drop him a little bit because of his COVID positive test? What do you think?
I wouldn't drop him. And Charlie Blackmon is a really good example of why you should not just look at an older player coming off a down season and say, well, this is the beginning of the end. Sometimes a down season is just that. Guys have down seasons. Charlie Blackmon, I mean, we talked about JD Martinez coming off a down season and it was still this amazing season. Charlie Blackmon was in the same boat in 2018. He hit 291 with 29 homers and 119 runs last season. He was still, or 2018.
Yeah, he did that in 2018.
He was still really good. And the thing, I definitely have questions about how good of a hitter Charlie Blackmon actually is at this point in his career. But those questions just don't matter because he has Coors Field. And as long as he has Coors Field, the floor is really, really high. Maybe the bottom falls out and he's just a disaster to the point where Coors Field can't help him. But I have a lot of doubts that that's going to happen because we haven't seen it yet. And so, yeah, I think Charlie Blackmon is a great fantasy pick at this cost, and likely to be at least a 4-category contributor. And maybe the stolen bases come back a little bit. Maybe it's a 10 steal pace rather than, a 2 steals or whatever he had last season.
I'm really surprised he's going 36th overall on average now, because so often he's available in round 4 in these expert leagues that we do. And that's just like that feels like easy money when you can get Charlie Blackmon, somebody who's so consistently ranked as a first rounder in fantasy. And, other than the steals, with the way he bounced back last year, there's really been no drop off. You won't find a more consistent source of batting average and runs scored, by the way, over 110 runs scored in 4 straight years. And, also a guy who won't set you back in the power categories at all. So, I love the value for Charlie Blackmon. I wish I had more shares of him.
Over the last 4 seasons that you just mentioned, Scott, 479 runs scored, are second most in baseball behind Mookie Betts. His .315 batting average during that same span is third best behind only Jose Altuve and DJ LeMahieu. Scott, real quick, would you take Blackmon over both George Springer and Ketel Marte?
Oh, man. I think that's how I think I have him ranked ahead of both. Let me double check that. No, I have Ketel Marte ranked ahead, probably just because he's second base eligible. And that's, obviously one of the weaker positions. I go Ketel Marte, Charlie Blackmon, George Springer with those.
Welcome back to Fantasy Baseball today, our Outfield Preview 2.0 Part 1. We are back. Rounds 4 and 5. Ketel Marte, 40.4. Ketel Marte, 40.4. Austin Meadows, 41.2. George Springer, 41.6. 3 players that are separated by 1.5 picks. Chris Bryant, 45. Whit Merrifield, 47.4. Aaron Judge is now in the 5th round, 49.8. And Eli Jimenez rounding out this group towards the end of round 5, 58.4. Scott, I just want to give you the floor to remind everybody why you like Ketel Marte as much as you do. You are basically the poster child of trusting breakouts from last year. And I don't want to say mid-career breakout because Ketel Marte is still young, but there are a lot of people who are skeptical. Why aren't you when it comes to Marte?
Yeah, I guess maybe surprising breakouts. Because if you look at what he did in the last 4 months of 2018, I mean, he had a near 900 OPS for basically the final 2/3 of 2018. I know a lot of people were on him as like a sleeper heading into last year. And then if you break down last season, like the first half, it's like, okay, Ketel Marte has to get worse. This is obviously too good to be true. And then the second half, he got actually even better. So you look at the 4-month stretch from 2018, the first half of 2019, the second half of 2019, Ketel Marte just kept getting better and better. And, I do think he probably overachieved to some small degree last year. The expected stats would suggest so, but like it also suggests he's a stud, even if he wasn't quite as good as last year. And when you have, like, in my mind, he was far and away the best second baseman last year. Like, it's such a weak position. I know we're talking about outfielders here, but like you're drafting him for second base most likely, and then just shifting him to the outfield if the opportunity presents itself. Because like getting that kind of like he's the one second base eligible player who I feel like could, be deserving of a second round pick.
918 OPS in the first half for Ketel Marte last year, an OPS of 1,081 in the second half. You mentioned that he just continued to get better. Chris, who do you think has the most upside in this group? Marte, Meadows, George Springer, Chris Bryant, Merrifield, Aaron Judge, and Eli Jimenez. Who has the most upside?
I guess it's probably got to be Aaron Judge, right? I mean, we've seen him be, one of the 3 or 4 best players in fantasy now. We've had 2 seasons in a row where he's failed to match that. And I think, he's more the player that he has been the last 2 seasons than he was during that breakout in 2017. But given his power, given the fact that he's one of the few guys with legitimate 50 homer potential without, especially that he won't kill your batting average like some of the other guys will. I think Aaron Judge probably has the most upside here.
Chris, what if I told you that in the head-to-head points mock that we did last week, you weren't actually in this, Aaron Judge went off the board at pick 94 to Adam Azer.
So I did listen to Friday's podcast, and
that's a little egregious.
It's ridiculous on its face. Like that's the kind of thing where it's just like, it's not even like you're less worried about injuries kind of thing. Like I certainly am less worried about injuries, but there's no risk in taking Aaron Judge at 90. Like that all the risk is gone and it's just upside. Like if Aaron Judge doesn't play at all in 2020, and you take him 94th overall, the last pick of the 8th round in a 12 team or a 7th round pick in a 15 team, you've taken all the risk out. Like it's not going to hurt your team. Like it will hurt your team. Sure. But your 9th round, your 8th round picks are probably going to bust pretty regularly.
I've been pretty scared of his injury. By way of reminder, it's a stress fracture in his rib, which dates back to last fall. And he just needs to keep it immobile for it to heal. And he kind of re-aggravated in February. And it just, if it doesn't work out this time, you're probably talking surgery. But the Yankees themselves are sounding more confident in Aaron Judge's return than in Giancarlo Stanton's return when Stanton just had a calf strain, a grade 1 calf strain. So yeah, I want to get Aaron Judge at a value. I don't want to have to pay face value for him, given my concerns over his risk. But 94th overall, that's it's a dream if you get him there.
Scott, in the same draft that we did, George Springer went in the 3rd round, and he's a great player for points leagues. Just so much volume, leads off for one of the best lineups in baseball. He has good plate discipline. He averaged 4.1 fantasy points per game last year, which was top 5. He was a top 5 overall hitter in terms of per game production. I question how much of last year was real, Scott, when it comes to George Springer. Was he helped out by the juice ball? He really was on pace to do things that he had never done before. He was on a 47 home run pace. And then I got Austin Meadows 3 rounds later in the same draft, in the 6th round. And this is something I've talked about too. I just don't understand why Austin Meadows does not get more respect than he does. In my opinion, based on ADP, these guys are going back to back. I feel like they should be going closer than they actually are. Why are there drafts where Austin Meadows is going 2 or even 3 rounds later than George Springer?
I do rank Springer ahead. I rank him 4 spots ahead among outfielders, at least in Roto. I don't know if, I have Meadows ahead of Judge. I don't see that as a huge gap. That's probably going 1 round apart, given how frequently outfielders go off the board in this range. So yeah, if there's that big of a gap, I agree it doesn't deserve to be that big. I'm skeptical of what Springer did last year because, as a 30-year-old, 29-year-old, like you said, he was doing things he had never done before. And I had pretty much gotten to the point where I didn't feel like he made the kind of contact where he could be a very good source of batting average. He hit 292 last year. He does make a lot of contact, but it was kind of a Chris Bryant situation. Remember when we were talking about Chris Bryant and is this profile really studly? And I was at that same point with Springer, and then he greatly improved the profile. I'm skeptical of it, but I think also if you're just talking about downside, Springer's a lot more proven than Meadows, and that has to factor into it too. So I do rank Springer ahead of Meadows. I agree with you. They shouldn't be that far apart.
Chris, we've talked a lot about Eli Jimenez the past couple of months, but I find it interesting that both he and Vladimir Guerrero Jr. are going back-to-back in ADP. They're basically going at pick 59, right on that turn, the 5th, 6th round. Who would you rather have between Eloy and Vladimir Guerrero Jr.?
I've drafted more Vlad than Eloy. Eloy is another guy who I just haven't drafted all that much. It's an interesting comparison, though, because I think Vlad has significantly more upside.
Why is that, though? Because, Eloy was regarded as a top prospect, too. Not
Eloy
the same level as Vlad, but...
That's the thing. Eloy was regarded as the 2nd best prospect in baseball, but that's kind of highlighting how, a ranked order can kind of mislead, because the difference between how Vlad was viewed and how Eloy was viewed was pretty significant. That being said, Eloy was much better last season than Vlad was. And, Vlad never had that stretch like Eloy did in the second half where he showed us what he's capable. I think the problem with Eloy Jimenez is I think the power is going to be there. I have questions about the batting average and the plate discipline in general. It makes it a somewhat risky profile. And given that he was good, but not particularly great in 2019, makes him a risky pick there. He did have good exit velocity numbers. He did have, a pretty good barrel rate. The one thing is when you look at like max exit velocity, when you look at barrel rate, he was more in I guess barrel rate, he was actually pretty high. Sorry, I was reading that wrong. In max exit velocity, he was like 46th. And that's usually one place when you're talking about power that it really, shows up. Like he didn't have any batted balls above 115 miles per hour. Vladimir Guerrero had 8. And so I think that highlights that Vladimir Guerrero is not a power hitting prospect. He's a hitting, like his calling card is going to be the bat overall, but he also showed more raw power than Eloy Jimenez. And so that's another place where I think the edge goes to Vlad, but it's also partially just if Eloy Jimenez hits his, 80th percentile outcome, it's probably still just like a lot of home runs and a decent batting average. And we've talked a lot about that this offseason where that's the easiest thing in the world to find right now in fantasy.
You're the high guy on Eli Jimenez here, right, Frank? You're the only one who's actually drafting him 61st overall, where he's going on average.
Yeah, I'm drafting him quite consistently. I think he's better in Roto, which is weird because he doesn't steal all that. He doesn't steal any bases. He's not going to steal.
Right.
But he doesn't really walk much, so that's going to hurt him in a points league a little bit. Just a 6% walk rate. But to me, I actually trust the hit tool more. I mean, this is something that was regarded as a plus tool for him throughout the minor leagues, and he was a 311 career hitter in the minors. So I think, the ultimate upside for Eloy is becoming Nolan Arenado in the outfield, becoming a 290 to 300 hitter, a legit 4-category contributor, JD Martinez, someone like that. That's where I can see Eloy kind of settling in his prime. And it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
As early as this year.
No reason to believe the prime is coming. It was, for his final 46 games last year, he hit 321 with 13 home runs, 960 OPS. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be talking about him in this range. He still struck out 25% of the time during that stretch. And really, like I could buy the full season line. Obviously he had that huge finish that salvages rookie season. I could buy where he finished for the full season more than I could buy just projecting out that final 46 game stretch. But what he delivered for the season, 267 batting average, 31 homers, 828 OPS. In terms of head-to-head points per game, that put him between Oscar Mercado and Yasiel Puig, like not near the range of outfielders we're talking about. And I understand that's a points league consideration, but then like Chris was saying for Roto leagues, other than home runs, what are you confident in him doing? And
I think he's going to contribute batting average. I think he's going to be like a 280 to 290
That's kind
hitter.
of a leap of faith thing, right? Especially at 61st overall.
It is. I mean, and we talk about that a lot, though, with Vlad, where it's kind of just like that blind faith, trusting the prospect pedigree. It's a substantial price tag because you got to take him on the 5-6 turn. But I don't think it would be crazy if we're talking about Eloy as a 2nd or 3rd round player next year.
I could see him doing what Carlos Santana did last year, 281, 34, 110, 93. The runs maybe a little bit lower. The problem is it does take it does require a substantial step forward for him to get to even a batting average ceiling in like the 290 range. And like, it's not that I don't like him or don't trust the skill set or the pedigree. It's more that I just like, is that the point in the draft where that upside is really worth paying for? Like, is his upside higher than Aaron Judge? No.
Is his upside higher than Josh Bell, who goes like 25 picks later? I think
his upside higher than Giancarlo Stanton's? Like, I know that's like a meme, me bringing up Giancarlo Stanton, but like Giancarlo Stanton's ADP is 14 spots behind
right.
Eloy Jimenez. I know we don't like Giancarlo Stanton, but like, give me Giancarlo Stanton every day over Eloy Jimenez, even with the health concerns. And so that's where like his upside's not higher than what Jorge Soler did last year.
Mm-hmm.
I think Nick Castellanos has similar upside. And so that's for me where it comes out, where I don't know if that's the point in the draft where it's 100% worth paying for that upside. And
I do like Soler quite a bit too, and we're about to get into those. The biggest issue for me is I'm just really wary of injuries, and I always have been, and maybe this is my fault as a fantasy player. My downside is that I kind of take injuries into account too much because I'm just so worried about Aaron Judge and Stanton, their ability to stay healthy, the fact that the Yankees have so much depth, especially in the outfield, that I don't like taking them at their current cost. Look, 94 for Judge, if he lasts that long into the 8th round, like, yeah, I can get behind that at that point. But, 4th, 5th round, where he was consistently going for a lot of draft season, it just seems like a big price to pay based on his injuries. And Stanton, I would bet 10 times out of 10, Eloy Jimenez has a higher batting average than Giancarlo Stanton this year.
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe, like it's certainly possible Stanton is going to be a high BABIP guy, but or should be a high BABIP guy. One thing I will point out, and this happens a lot with prospects when it comes to their injuries. Jorge Soler is actually another example of it. Yordan Alvarez. When we discount guys for injuries, because players in the major league hurt us when we're playing fantasy when they get hurt, we stick with that in our minds. But here's Eloy Jimenez's games played as a professional. And we won't go back to rookie ball, but 122 last season, 108 in 2018, 89 in 2017, 112 in 2016. Now, there are fewer games available in the minors, but you're still talking about a guy who hasn't played a full season's worth of games at any level yet.
Yeah, that is fair. And maybe I just need to be burned by it before I start to fade him myself. Let's get into round 6 and 7 here, and we'll wrap up here with this group. Joey Gallo, mentioned earlier on, did test positive as of today, Monday, July 6th, for COVID. Giancarlo Stanton, 73.6. Tommy Pham also tested positive, 78.6. Victor Robles, 80.4. And Jorge Soler, 82.8. Scott, of this group, Gallo, Stanton, Pham, Robles, Soler, who are you most likely to draft?
I'm most likely to draft Soler. And
which is another one similar to Ketel Marte, where, this is your MO this year, Scott. It's, look, if they broke out last year, you're buying the discount, because if he comes anywhere close to what he did last year, then you are getting him at a discount.
Yeah,
at his current ADP.
Yes, Chris has talked about this a lot with injuries and just like how sharp the fantasy baseball community as a whole has gotten with, we just have so much data available to us, and it's reliable, and we all kind of look to the same things, that it's hard to differentiate your opinion from the consensus and to find these market inefficiencies. Chris chooses to target players perceived as injury prone. I choose to target players perceived as flukes, because if the data backs it up, then the only reason we're downgrading them is just because we feel like we should know better. Like, okay, yeah, he had a huge season that's backed up by data, but he's not really that good. We know better, right? And I think we tend to downgrade them too much because of that. So Soler, 83rd overall for a guy who hit 50 home runs basically last year. That's stupid value. And so he actually even got better in the second half. It
is ironical that you brought up my injury approach.
Is that a word? Ironical?
Yeah.
Okay.
I said it, so it's a word.
Ironic probably would have worked there.
I know, but I was being ironical.
Okay. All right.
63 games, 109 games, 97 games, 105 games, 86 games, 75 games. Those were Jorge Soler's games played for every season of his professional career, going back to rookie ball, not counting rookie ball, before he miraculously played 162 games last season. And so this is a good example of what I mean when I talk about, injuries being a potential market inefficiency is, Jorge Soler, a lot of his injuries have been sort of out of sight, out of mind. Like he wasn't all that good in 2017, so we don't really care that he didn't play that many games. 2018, didn't really register for fantasy, like 820 OPS, but only played 61 games. And so a lot of the injuries that Jorge Soler has had, like last year was literally the first time he's ever stayed healthy for a full season. But a lot of those weren't when he was in our minds. And so nobody thinks of Jorge Soler as an injury-prone player. And if you're talking about a guy who, had basically been a fantasy non-entity for, his major league debut was back in 2014, had basically been a fantasy non-entity every season until this year. If that person also was being dinged for injuries, they certainly wouldn't be going 83rd overall. We would be pretty skeptical of that. And instead, he's being drafted kind of like like Scott said, there is that skepticism of what he did last season, but it's not exactly like he's being drafted just behind Eugenio Suarez, basically. Eugenio Suarez is 74.8. He did the same thing Jorge Soler did last season, but he doesn't have the history of injuries that Jorge Soler does.
I think I actually have more confidence in Soler delivering that kind of power production again than I do Suarez.
Yeah, the underlying numbers are far in the favor of Soler in terms of how hard he hits the ball, his exit velocities, his expected slugging percentage. Like, there's so many things that are in the favor of Soler versus Eugenio Suarez.
Sure. Well, but what Eugenio Suarez has in his favor is he had been a good Major League Baseball player before 2019.
Sure.
Jorge Soler never had been.
Sure.
There's a reason nobody had Jorge Soler on their teams to start last season. He needed to hit 48 home runs to be fantasy relevant. And so I think that kind of highlights the ways in which we inconsistently apply that injury-prone label and the ways we inconsistently ding certain players for it. And that's why I think buying into a Giancarlo Stanton, who's really...
I knew it was going here.
Injury.
I knew it.
But
it always ends in Stanton.
You can add... he is the most obvious player, I think. But you can add... Who's another player who's just kind of... Well, he's really good, but he has injury. Bryce Harper has kind of been that guy over the last couple of years. I'm trying to think of an actual example that isn't Giancarlo Stanton, but he is the best example of that. And so, I think Joey Gallo is another case where we're just kind of ignoring the fact that he missed most of last season, the majority of last season with injuries.
I won't draft him either.
Yeah, it hurt. It really pains me. I love Joey Gallo. I've been like the biggest Joey Gallo optimist on this podcast for years. And now it's just like the 70 games he had last season. We're like, yep, that's it. That's who Joey Gallo is now.
Let me spin this another way for Jorge Soler, though, because I think particularly the version we saw in the second half last year, incredible hard contact, big drop in strikeout rate in the second half. Like the profile Jorge Soler showed in the second half last year was like Giancarlo Stanton during his 2017 MVP season when he already had that injury-prone reputation. And, the follow-up from that 2017 MVP season for Stanton was to draft him in the first round.
Mm-hmm.
So, getting Jorge Soler in round 8, or what is it, round 7 technically, I guess.
Yeah.
I just don't see how you could see that as anything less than a value. Relative.
That's all fair.
Yeah.
I think it's crazy to have Jorge Soler ranked above Giancarlo Stanton, like the both of you do.
Chris, what if I told you
I think
seriously?
That's all a good argument for Jorge Soler, and I'm actually fine drafting him at this cost.
Mm-hmm.
But we just compared like Jorge Soler's best 2 months to Giancarlo Stanton's best entire season. And if you list out the best seasons for Jorge Soler and Giancarlo Stanton, 8 of the top 9 are Giancarlo Stanton. And he has the best one.
They also have the same number of 40 home run seasons in their career. And what if I told you, Chris, what if I told you that Stanton is just not that good? Hold on. Give me a second here.
But that's not true.
Because
No, but you're going to point to 2018, which was a down year for him.
Well, he had 2 down years. I mean, how many excuses are we going to make for the guy? Because his MVP season, he was an OPS over 1,000.
Yeah.
That was sandwiched by, he had an 815 OPS in 2016. He had an 852 OPS in 2018. So you're talking about 2 of his last 3 healthy seasons. He's been an 852 OPS or worse in 2 of those. Last year, an 852 OPS was basically Max Kepler, Michael Conforto, Danny Santana. I mean, that's what that was Stanton back in 2018 when he managed to stay healthy. The last time we saw him that season, he had a 29.9% strikeout rate, and he just can't hit. He cannot hit breaking pitches. I watch a lot of Yankee games. It looks like he swings with his eyes closed. It's not a joke. Like from 2014 to 2018, he had 214 or less against breaking balls. The one season where he was better than that was the season he won the MVP. That's the outlier.
That's a thing Marlins fans have said forever about Giancarlo Stanton, and like it may be true that he cannot hit breaking balls. It doesn't matter. like he's good.
If he hits 260 with a 40 home run pace, though, how much does that really move the needle?
He hasn't been on a 40 home run pace.
I mean, the last time we saw him healthy in 2018, what do you have? He had less than 40 home runs.
No, he had 38 in 158 games. 2016, he had 27 in 119. 2015, he had 27 in 74. He's been on a 40 home run pace pretty much every season.
Yeah, but how much? I'm asking how much does that move the needle? I mean, his batting average is 266, 240, 265 in those 3 seasons. I just think his MVP season is an outlier, and
it definitely is an outlier. But Jorge Soler's 2019 was an outlier for like 1,000 different reasons. And we're drafting him over Giancarlo Stanton. Like that's my only thing. Fine. Criticize Giancarlo Stanton for not being that good, or for like, he is that good, but criticize him for like not being able to hit breaking balls, but like when specifically comparing him to Jorge Soler, none of that is not true of Jorge Soler. Like we're comparing Jorge Soler's best season to Giancarlo Stanton's bad seasons. Giancarlo Stanton's best season was clearly better than Jorge Soler's. Jorge Soler can't stay healthy. Giancarlo Stanton's in a better lineup.
It's just weird saying that about a player who just played every game versus Stanton, who played 18.
I know it feels weird, but that doesn't make it any less true.
It's true.
And that's what I mean about injuries, is that we are so scientifically minded about so much of fantasy baseball. Like we apply the scientific method for all, like, you know, we're testing FIP, and everybody's trying to create a better version of FIP. And we've got all these StatCast metrics that are rigorously tested and weighted against historical performance and all this stuff. And we use all that to inform our approach to fantasy baseball. And injuries, we don't have anything like that. And so it's all gut, and it's all feel, and it's all, this guy hurt me, that guy didn't hurt me. And that's my point, is that Jorge Soler, when he got hurt, it didn't hurt us. And so we don't hold it against him. But he's gotten hurt every single year of his career before last year.
Chris, I have the answer. Draft neither of them.
Or draft Stanton.
Oh, man. All right. Well, I want to wrap it up there. We're going to have our, preview part 2 tomorrow. We'll get into the rest of the outfielders. We really only got to 25-ish today, but we will get into more outfielders tomorrow. We'll have our sleepers, breakouts, and busts. For Scott and Chris, I am Frank. Thank you all for listening and watching on the Fantasy Baseball Today YouTube channel. Talk to you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.